I'm picturing a scene from 1438, where I'm a peasant mother in the French countryside. My heart breaking because my 6-year-old boy has been gone for 3 days now. As a peasant mom in rural France in 1438, my world's crumbling since my 6-year-old son vanished 3 days ago, leaving me in anguish. No matter how much I pray, deep down, I feel this gut-wrenching certainty that he's never coming back home. Despite my fervent prayers, a heavy dread settles in my soul, whispering that my boy will never return to our little home. The folks in the village keep muttering about that nobleman's castle up on the hill, talking about eerie screams drifting from its towers under the cover of night. Villagers trade hushed stories about the looming castle on the hill, where chilling cries echo from its spires after dark. They say kids go missing whenever the Baron's men show up, looking for young ones to serve in his grand household. Whispers spread that children disappear every time the Baron's soldiers come around, seeking youngsters for so-called special duties in his estate. What scares me most isn't just that my son's gone. It's the thought that the man behind it is hailed across France as some kind of divine soldier. The deepest terror gripping me isn't only my child's absence. It's knowing the man responsible is celebrated throughout France as a sacred warrior. Gilles De Rais, the Marshal of France, fought alongside the Holy Joan of Arc, defending the faith against those English heretics. Gilles De Rais, France's marshal and companion to the blessed Joan of Arc, was a champion of the faith, battling English heretics with righteous zeal. Those same hands that once clutched holy relics and blessed swords are now, I fear, doing unspeakable things to children, so vile even demons might shudder. The very hands that once held sacred relics and wielded consecrated blades are now, I suspect, committing horrors on children that would make even demons recoil in awe. As I kneel in our village church, pleading with Christ for mercy, I don't yet know my son screamed his last in a secret ritual chamber beneath the Baron's private chapel. While I'm on my knees in the village church, begging Jesus for compassion, I'm unaware that my boy's final cries echoed in a hidden chamber below the Baron's personal chapel. I'm clueless that his blood was smeared across symbols painted on altar stones, stolen right out of holy churches. I have no idea that his lifeblood was used to mark occult symbols on altar stones, pilfered from sanctified churches. I don't know his final moments were spent as a twisted amusement for a man who went from a holy knight to a servant of darkness, worshipping forces the church forbids. I'm oblivious that my son's last breaths were entertainment for a man who turned from a saintly knight into a devotee of evil, bowing to powers condemned by Christianity. This isn't just my personal tragedy. It's part of a larger web of horrors spun by a man who twisted faith into calculated murder. My loss isn't a standalone sorrow. It's one strand in a chilling tapestry of terror, woven by a man who warped devotion into methodical slaughter. Gil didn't just kill kids. He crafted twisted religious excuses for his crimes, turning his castle into a demonic monastery where torture was his form of worship. Gil wasn't content with merely murdering children. He concocted perverse theological reasons for his atrocities, transforming his fortress into a satanic cloister where agony became his prayer. Death itself became his sacrament, a mockery of everything holy. He turned death into a perverse ritual, a blasphemous imitation of sacred rites. This isn't just about a knight who lost his way. It's about a man who swore monastic vows to God but ended up as history's most monstrous killer. This tale isn't merely of a knight who strayed. It's about a man who took holy vows to serve God but became the most depraved murderer in history. The warrior monk who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Saint Joan confessed to crimes so awful that his judges wept as they wrote down his words. The monk-turned-warrior who fought beside Saint Joan admitted to deeds so horrific that the men judging him broke down in tears while recording his confession. If you're into uncovering the buried truths of history like this, give that like button a tap and subscribe for more stories like these. If you love digging into the hidden corners of history, consider hitting like and subscribing for more tales like this one. And drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from. I'd love to hear. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'm curious to connect with you. To grasp how Gilles De Rais went from a holy warrior to a child-slaying monk, we've got to start with the man he was before darkness took over. To understand how Gilles De Rais morphed from a sacred soldier to a monk who killed children, we need to explore who he was before evil consumed him. Born in 1394 to one of France's mightiest noble families, Gilles inherited sprawling estates in Brittany that made him one of Europe's richest men. Coming into the world in 1394, born to a powerful French noble family, Gilles was handed vast lands in Brittany, making him one of the wealthiest men in Europe. More than that, he was raised in a military tradition that prized bravery, honor, and devotion to God above all else. Beyond wealth, he grew up steeped in a military code that valued courage, integrity, and service to God over any worldly gain. Young Gilles was the picture of what medieval folks admired in a warrior monk, everything they dreamed a knight should be. In his youth, Gilles was the ideal medieval warrior monk, embodying all the virtues that society held dear in a knight. Now, picture this. Gilles would slowly torment his victims, gathering their blood in sacred chalices while reciting chants to demons, names he dug up from forbidden texts. As a historian, it chills me to think of Gilles torturing those kids at an agonizing pace, collecting their blood in holy goblets while muttering invocations to demons, names he'd uncovered in banned manuscripts. But the killing was just the start of his twisted rituals. Yet, the murders were only the opening act of his depraved ceremonies. He'd carve up the bodies, keeping certain organs in jars, convinced they held some kind of magical power. Gilles would dismember the corpses, preserving specific organs in containers, believing they possessed supernatural qualities. Using the victim's blood, he'd smear symbols on the walls, trying to open what his books called portals for otherworldly beings to slip into our world. With the blood of those poor souls, he'd paint occult symbols across the walls, attempting to create gateways, as his texts described, for unearthly entities to cross into reality. Sometimes, he'd even keep the heads, claiming the eyes of innocent kids could peer into the spirit world. Occasionally, he'd preserve their heads, insisting that the eyes of murdered children could gaze into the realm of spirits. Getting rid of the evidence took a carefully planned system involving his most loyal servants. Disposing of the bodies required a meticulous setup, relying on his most trusted attendants. They'd burn the remains in special ovens built to reduce flesh and bone to nothing, leaving no trace for suspicious villagers or church officials to find. His men would incinerate the remains in custom furnaces designed to completely destroy flesh and bone, ensuring no evidence could be uncovered by wary villagers or church investigators. Gilles scared his servants into silence, threatening eternal damnation with religious talk to keep their lips sealed. He bullied his servants into secrecy, using holy rhetoric to warn them of divine punishment if they ever spoke of what they saw. As months went by, Gilles' hunger for killing only grew stronger, not weaker. Over time, Gilles' craving for murder didn't fade. It only intensified. At first, he thought one sacrifice might bring him magical riches, but soon he believed the demons demanded regular offerings to stay pleased. Initially, he hoped a single killing would grant him supernatural wealth, but he later became convinced that the demons required constant sacrifices to keep their favor. Kids started vanishing from villages all over Brittany at a terrifying pace. Children began disappearing from towns across Brittany at an alarming rate. Some villages lost dozens of young ones in just a single year. Certain communities saw scores of their children vanish within a single year's time. The Baron's reputation as a devout man gave him the perfect shield for his crimes. Gilles' image as a pious nobleman served as an ideal cover for his atrocities. When he offered to take poor families' kids as altar boys or monastery helpers, parents saw it as a blessing from God, not a deadly trap. When he proposed taking children from struggling families to serve as altar boys or monastery aides, parents viewed it as divine opportunity, not a fatal snare. When those kids never came back, Gilles would say they'd taken holy vows that cut them off from their families or had passed away serving God in his chapel. If those children never returned, Gilles claimed they'd sworn sacred oaths requiring isolation from their kin or had died in service to God within his private chapel. Those close to him could see the toll it took on Gilles himself. People who knew him well could tell the psychological strain was wearing him down. The bold, cheerful knight who once inspired loyalty with his bravery turned paranoid, secretive, and quick to fly into rages. The confident, jovial knight who once rallied men with his courage became suspicious, withdrawn, and prone to sudden outbursts of fury. His old friends noticed he started acting like a religious zealot, always talking about divine signs and demonic forces while shunning normal human interaction. His former companions saw him take on the traits of a fanatic, constantly ranting about heavenly omens and evil influences while avoiding regular human contact. Gilles' reign of terror was made possible by a feudal system that gave lords like him near total control over their people's lives, paired with a church too tangled in politics to act as a moral compass. Gilles' horrific spree was enabled by a feudal order that handed nobles like him unchecked power over their subjects, combined with a church too corrupted by political ties to provide ethical oversight. In 15th century France, peasant kids had no legal protection against noble predators, especially ones who hid their crimes behind religious words. Back in 1400s France, the children of peasants had no legal defense against aristocratic monsters, particularly those who cloaked their evils in the language of faith. The Catholic Church, which should have been a moral safeguard against noble excess, was compromised by its reliance on lords like Gilles for support. The Church, meant to be a guardian against aristocratic overreach, was weakened by its dependence on nobles like Gilles for patronage. Local priests, who owed their jobs to men like him, hesitated to dig into rumors about their benefactor's actions. Priests in the area, whose positions relied on nobles like Gilles, were reluctant to probe into whispers about their patron's deeds. When peasant families raised concerns about missing kids to church officials, they were usually brushed off with talk of God's mysterious plans or told to be thankful their children were serving in a noble's chapel. When desperate families brought worries about their lost children to church authorities, they were often dismissed with vague explanations about God's will or encouraged to feel grateful their kids were supposedly serving in a lord's private chapel. Even worse, the church's own teachings about evil spirits gave Gilles a twisted religious excuse for his crimes. More disturbingly, the church's doctrines on supernatural evil provided Gilles with a warped theological basis for his atrocities. Medieval Christianity taught that demons were real and could grant power to those who served them. The Christianity of the Middle Ages held that demons were actual beings who could bestow earthly power on humans willing to pledge their allegiance. The same church leaders who condemned witchcraft and devil worship built a worldview that made those practices seem believable to a man desperate for otherworldly help. The very religious authorities who denounced sorcery and demonic worship created an intellectual framework that made such acts seem plausible to a man craving supernatural aid. The monastic tradition itself helped Gilles avoid suspicion. The traditions of monasteries actually aided Gilles in dodging detection. Medieval monasteries were supposed to keep their activities private, rarely facing outside inspection. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were expected to maintain secrecy, with their practices seldom subject to external scrutiny. When Gilles took on the role and language of a religious hermit, it gave him a perfect excuse for his secretive behavior and strange noises. By adopting the guise and speech of a pious recluse, Gilles found an ideal justification for his odd behavior and the eerie sounds coming from his castle. As I imagine it, Gilles would chat with the boys about their families, their dreams of rising in the church, and their knowledge of the Bible, all together details he'd later twist to heighten their emotional torment. Picture Gilles sitting with those kids, asking about their loved ones, their hopes for a religious future, and their grasp of scripture, collecting tidbits he'd use to amplify their psychological pain down the line. He'd give them cozy beds, hearty meals, and even little holy trinkets to make them believe they were truly under kind, godly guidance. The boys were provided soft beds, plentiful food, and small sacred tokens, all to convince them they'd found a benevolent spiritual mentor. The torture started slowly, dressed up as religious correction. The cruelty crept in gradually, masked as pious discipline. When boys asked about visiting their families, Gilles told them such worldly ties hindered their spiritual growth. If a boy wondered when he could see his kin, Gilles would lecture that earthly attachments blocked their path to divine enlightenment. Kids who admitted to missing home were punished with solitary prayer and fasting for not being devoted enough to God. Those who confessed to homesickness faced isolation for prayer and starvation as a penalty for lacking sufficient faith in the Lord. Over time, the comfortable rooms turned into locked cells, meals shrank, and punishments for so-called spiritual failings piled up daily. Gradually, The cozy quarters became barred cells, food rations dwindled, and penalties for supposed religious shortcomings multiplied each day. Poita's final weeks were filled with dread, carefully stoked by Gilles' twisted version of religious teaching. In his last weeks, Poita lived in constant fear, a terror meticulously nurtured through Gilles' perverse spin on spiritual instruction. The boy was made to help set up ritual chambers, unaware of what the candles, symbols, and odd artifacts were meant to do. Poita was forced to assist in preparing ceremonial rooms, clueless about the purpose of the candles, symbols, and strange objects around him. He had to scrub bloodstains off stone altars, told they were holy relics. He was ordered to clean blood marks from stone altars, with Gilles claiming they were sacred artifacts. Most heartbreakingly, he watched other boys vanish one by one, always told they'd reached spiritual perfection and been whisked straight to heaven. Most gut-wrenching of all, Poita saw other boys disappear one after another, each time hearing they'd achieved divine purity and been carried directly to paradise. When Poita's time came, Gilles performed the ritual with the cold precision of a warped religious service. When it was Poita's turn, Gilles carried out the ceremony with the chilling accuracy of a corrupted holy rite. He told the boy he'd been chosen for the greatest spiritual honor, that his death would please God and bless his family. Gilles assured the boy he was selected for the highest divine privilege, that his sacrifice would glorify God and bring favor to his kin. Even as the torture began, Gilles kept using religious words, calling the pain purification and the nearing death a sacred martyrdom. As the torment started, Gilles spoke in pious terms, describing the agony as cleansing and the approaching death as blessed martyrdom. Gilles' reign of terror finally ended in 1440 when the Duke of Brittany, pushed by growing evidence and political pressure, ordered his arrest for heresy, sodomy, and murder. In 1440, Gilles' horrific spree came to a halt when the Duke of Brittany, spurred by mounting proof and political demands, had him arrested on charges of heresy, unnatural acts, and killing. The trial that followed was one of the medieval world's most shocking legal spectacles, with testimony so horrifying that some records were locked away for centuries to shield public decency. The court case that ensued became one of the Middle Ages' most sensational trials, with revelations so appalling that some documents were sealed for hundreds of years to protect public morality. The investigation uncovered a web of complicity stretching through Gilles' household and into the wider feudal system that had enabled his crimes. The probe revealed a network of guilt running through Gilles' estate and beyond, into the broader feudal structure that had allowed his atrocities to thrive. Servants who helped dispose of bodies, clerks who faked letters from victims, and even local priests who supplied stolen holy items for his rituals were arrested alongside him. Attendants who aided in burning remains, scribes who forged messages from the children, and even some nearby priests who provided pilfered consecrated items for his ceremonies were apprehended with their master. The sheer scale of institutional failure, letting over 140 kids vanish without serious investigation, stunned even the toughest medieval justice officials. The massive breakdown of systems, allowing more than 140 children to disappear without proper scrutiny, shocked even the most hardened officials of medieval justice. Gilles' own words during the trial gave a chilling glimpse into the mind of a monk-turned serial killer. Gilles' testimony at the trial offered a haunting window into the psyche of a monk who'd become a relentless murderer. He didn't just admit to the killings. He laid out the twisted religious logic behind them, explaining how he believed torturing innocents would bring him supernatural riches and power. He not only confessed to the murders but detailed the perverse theological reasoning, describing how he thought harming the innocent would grant him otherworldly wealth and influence. His calm, systematic account of his crimes, wrapped in the language of faith, showed a complete lack of human compassion. His composed, methodical recounting of his deeds, cloaked in religious devotion, revealed an utter absence of normal human empathy. The Church's reaction showed how deeply troubled they were that one of their own could fall so far into evil's grasp. The Church's response laid bare their profound unease that one of their devout could plunge so completely into Satan's service. While they called his actions pure evil, Church leaders grappled with explaining how a man steeped in religious study could become history's most monstrous killer. Though they condemned his deeds as blatantly wicked, church officials struggled to understand how a man immersed in spiritual learning could turn into history's most depraved murderer. Some scholars argued his deep dive into forbidden texts had opened his soul to demonic influence. Certain theologians suggested his intense study of banned manuscripts had left his spirit vulnerable to evil forces. Gilles' execution in October 1440 was carried out with grand ceremony, meant to show that justice was done and divine order restored. In October 1440, Gilles was put to death in an elaborate execution, designed to prove that justice had prevailed and godly balance was reinstated. But the bigger questions his crimes raised, how religious institutions could fail so badly, how trusted spiritual leaders could abuse their power so thoroughly, went mostly unanswered. Yet the deeper issues his atrocities brought up, how spiritual institutions could collapse so completely, how revered figures could exploit their authority so systematically, remained largely unaddressed. Looking at it now, modern psychology suggests Gilles showed signs of psychopathy mixed with extreme religious delusions. Today, psychologists might say Gilles displayed traits of psychopathy combined with grandiose spiritual fantasies. His knack for keeping up a pious front while committing horrific acts shows the danger of smart people using religious authority to hide a complete lack of morality. His ability to maintain a holy facade while carrying out monstrous deeds highlights the threat posed by cunning individuals who wield spiritual authority to conceal their moral void. His case set a legal precedent for prosecuting religious figures who misuse their power. Gilles' trial established a legal standard for holding accountable spiritual leaders who abuse their authority. But it also showed how easily systems meant to protect the innocent could be twisted by those who knew how to exploit religious trust. Yet it also exposed how effortlessly systems designed to safeguard the vulnerable could be manipulated by those skilled at exploiting faith and devotion. The kids who died in his ritual chambers paid the ultimate price for a society that failed to shield them from predators in trusted roles. Those children who perished in his ceremonial rooms bore the ultimate cost of a society that couldn't protect them from monsters in positions of trust. Their silenced voices, cut off by torture and death, still echo through time, urging us to remember their pain and learn from the system failures that allowed it. The voices of those lost to torment and death still resonate across centuries, pleading with us to recall their suffering and heed the institutional breakdowns that enabled it. The castle walls that once rang with screams have long since crumbled to ruins. The fortress walls that once carried the echoes of cries have faded into decayed remnants. But the questions they raise about religious authority, institutional responsibility, and protecting the vulnerable are just as pressing today as they were 600 years ago. Yet the issues they bring up about spiritual authority, systemic accountability, and safeguarding the defenseless remain as urgent now as they were 6 centuries back. In facing the legacy of history's most twisted night, we confront hard truths about human nature and the corruption of spiritual power that no progress can fully erase. When we grapple with the aftermath of history's most depraved night, we face uncomfortable realities about humanity and the perversion of sacred authority that no amount of advancement can completely eliminate. The only true tribute to Gilles' victims is our resolve to ensure such systematic evil never again hides behind respected institutions or trusted religious figures. The only fitting memorial to those lost to Gilles' crimes is our commitment to preventing such calculated wickedness from finding shelter within esteemed establishments or revered spiritual leaders. If this dive into history's dark corners has you eager to uncover more hidden truths, I've got another tale from the shadows you won't want to miss. If this journey into the grim side of history has you hooked on discovering more buried stories, I've prepared another trip into the past shadows you'll want to check out. Click the video popping up on your screen to explore another shocking chapter history tried to bury. Tap the video appearing on your screen now to dive into another startling piece of history that time tried to erase. And if this story gripped you as much as it did me, hit that subscribe button so we can keep peeling back history's layers together. If this tale grabbed you like it did me, smash that subscribe button so we can continue uncovering history's hidden layers side by side. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are plenty more stories waiting to be told. Those silenced voices need to be remembered, and there are countless more tales out there waiting to be shared.